let's take a look at the Dreamcast version of WWF Attitude. Thankfully, I've gotten very familiar with this game, so yeah, it wasn't too hard to talk about. It's a game I really liked when it was released, but I've kind of soured on it over the past few years, especially after going through all the different versions of it. This is the first time I've ever played the Dreamcast version of the game. Yeah, it's, I don't know. I liked the ECW Hardcore Revolution version on this console, so I was at least hopeful that maybe this one would be pretty good. And no, I think this is probably the worst version of WWF Attitude. A part of me was kind of happy to get this one over with, because I really used to like WWF Attitude, and I feel kind of nostalgic for it. And now I'm just kind of ready to move on to the other stuff that's on the console. It was a game that was really great in 1999, but now after playing through all these different versions of it and just dealing with this engine that Acclaim had, I'm kind of tired of it. It's still an okay game, but man, am I kind of tired of it. Like every other version of this game and everything that uses this engine, there's no story mode to it. But you can play the career mode, which, it is what it is. This is not the best career mode out of any of the video games for really the PS1 and 64 or the Dreamcast. Nothing has really changed from the other versions of the game. It feels like a direct port from the PS1. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but yeah, there's some other issues with this. Like I've said with probably every version of this game that I've looked at, and many of the versions of ECW Hardcore Revolution and ECW Anarchy Rules now, if you liked the engine from WWF Warzone, you're probably going to like this one. If you hated that, you're going to have a terrible time with it, because yeah, it's definitely something that's just not all that great. At least I don't think it's all that great anymore. After playing the SmackDown games, No Mercy, and WrestleMania 2000, that's what I would rather be playing instead of this. Or really most of the WCW games for the N64. There's just a lot of stuff that I would rather be playing instead of WWF Attitude. All the same game modes are here. There really wasn't anything added to this from the other two versions of the game. It still has the career mode, which was the big draw for me, even if it is kind of tedious to get through. I initially thought the roster was great. I didn't notice any additions or subtractions from the other two versions. This was the last version of WWF Attitude to be released, and it was released right before Acclaim was going to lose the license for the WWF. That's something that I want to talk about later on, because it's kind of interesting. This game doesn't really feel rushed. It just feels like it's the exact same. It doesn't look as good as what Anarchy Rules looks, and that's part of the problem. It just doesn't look like they were able to do a whole lot to really improve the game. And yeah, it's a bit of a disappointment. That's probably the nicest thing that I can say to it. The gameplay is perfectly fine. If you've played any of the other versions of WWF Attitude, you'll know exactly what you need to do. All the moves pretty much translated, so you know pretty much what you need to do in this game to do anything. And there is that familiarity with it, but I don't know. This one just feels off. There's a bit of an awkwardness to it that I just don't remember from the other versions of the game. Overall, the gameplay isn't too bad. I still do like this version of the game, or at least WWF Attitude and Warzone. I don't have a huge problem with the Acclaim wrestling games. There's just other stuff that I would rather play instead of them. There was something just a little bit off about the controls that I didn't notice when I played Hardcore Revolution. there's just this awkwardness to it where you feel like you did something right and the game just decides that it's not going to do the move that you typed in. It's just a little weird. It's probably the best way I can put it. I didn't notice a big difference between this version and the PS1 or the N64 versions of the game. The graphics are fine for the time. There are a few minor issues that are present with all of the Acclaim wrestling games that use the Warzone engine. The ring entrances, the ring, and the crowd, they all look good. The character animations and models, they look pretty good. I guess they kind of look a little better than what the PS1 looked like, but again, it's not like a big difference between the two. I still think, probably WWF Royal Rumble looks a lot better than this, and Anarchy Rules looks way better than this game did. I've never really had an issue with just how the Acclaim wrestling games looked. There are some minor things with clipping or a lack of facial reactions. It isn't enough to really significantly impact this game, but it is noticeable. As far as I know, I haven't pointed this out, but changing just who you're targeting is really annoying in this game. And it's been annoying in all of the games that Acclaim has done. It's just kind of frustrating to get a handle on it because you need to cycle through all the different people. And that's probably the only thing that was really messing with me from both a gameplay and a visual standpoint in this. Overall, the graphics are fine. They're perfectly fine. They aren't as good as what the Dreamcast could have put out, and that's kind of part of the problem with it. It does have a bunch of little issues that kind of pile up the more that you play. You just start noticing little things with it that kind of bug you as the game goes on. It isn't terrible, but it does add up over time, and it kind of makes things it might change your opinion a little bit on it. It makes things a little awkward and weird when you're playing it. I looked at 3 reviews this time. The publications that I read from were Game Informer, GameSpot, and IGN. I noticed that the game received lower scores than the other 2 versions of it. I found this a little strange because all 3 came out in the same year. Game Informer gave the game an 8.5 out of 10. It's a fairly short review. It focuses on the graphics and how dated the game is. The reviewer pointed out how a quarter of the roster was not with the WWF anymore. And that's kind of interesting. I didn't know this when I first started playing it. It's one of the cool things that you find when you go through some of these older reviews. They bring up stuff that you just hadn't thought of at the time. I think pointing out how the graphics were improved, but not really pointing out what was actually improved was a little strange. I didn't notice that at all. I wasn't really aware that they changed a whole lot with the graphics. It kind of felt like the same game, and it really wasn't optimized for what could have happened or what they could have done with the Dreamcast version. GameSpot shared a pretty similar opinion by saying the game might have been better if Acclaim had a few more months with the license. The game was given a 6.8 out of 10 for them, and with everything that I've seen in this reviews, I can kind of understand why the scores were lower. This does kind of feel like releasing in one of the Madden games, where they just pump out a new version of Madden, make some minor changes, and hope that people buy it again. That's a little bit what it was like with WWF Attitude. In a very padded review, IGN gave the game an 8 out of 10. The reviewer brings up kind of the awkwardness with the controls and some of the issues with the roster. There's also just a lot of fluff in this review, which makes me think the author was being paid by the word. I think GameSpot got it right with this one by putting it at a 6.8 out of 10, and they bring up just how this game was actually rushed, and it made me feel a little bit different about the game when I went back and looked at it. but not to the point where I really wanted to revisit what I gave the game when I wrote my blog post for it. This is just an average game, and they could have used more time, because they pumped this thing out right before they lost the license, so they couldn't make it look as good as they did. They couldn't kind of fix some of the issues with controls. They couldn't do a lot of the things that they had wanted to do. And that becomes really apparent when you look at ECW Anarchy Rules, because it essentially is the same engine, or at least the same foundation of an engine, but the graphics look way better than this. And just the controls are a lot better, and everything in that version of ECW Anarchy Rules is way better than what we got with WWF Attitude here. And it kind of made me feel a little bit different about ECW Hardcore Revolution on the Dreamcast, because that game doesn't look too different from what they did with Attitude. I'm glad that I only have one more version of this engine to go through, because I'm really getting just kind of sick of playing WWF Attitude and playing with Acclaim's wrestling engine. There's really nothing wrong with it, but it's just getting more irritating as it goes along, because what else can you really say about it at this point? I've played 8 of these games, and I'm just kind of done with it right now. This is an average wrestling game that's on, the PS1, the N64, and the Dreamcast. I think the Dreamcast version is probably the worst out of the 3. It was quickly surpassed by many of the better wrestling games that were released around the same time, or released a year later. It's not as good as the SmackDown games, it's not as good as No Mercy, it's not as good as WrestleMania 2000, but hey, when it was released, it was a lot of fun to play. I have a lot of great memories of playing this with my friends, even if this version is not that great, and looking back at it now, I can see a lot more flaws with it. And there's a lot of stuff that just kind of bugs me a little bit more. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.